Hi folks, just a quick introduction here just to give you a bit of background about what this video is and what I'm hopefully going to do in the future. So every Monday I do a live stream and there generally is a topic that we talk about, and I'm aware that not everybody is interested in maybe staying for a full 2-hour live stream and maybe wanting to interact, but you might be interested in what the main topic is. So what I'm going to try and do on a Monday now, and I started with this yesterday, is that I'm going to try and do the main topic, the main piece of it to camera during the live stream. I'll then be able to clip that out, upload it as a separate video, so those of you that are not interested in the live streams can just watch the main kind of topic and then comment down below and let me know what you think on that topic without having to go in and try and pick out the bones of what I've been talking about through a 2-hour or a 3-hour live stream. So if you like the idea of this, please do let me know down in the comments. I'm using this as a bit of a kind of a test, a bit of feedback. Let me know what you think, and also if you have any comments about the topic itself tonight, why not let me know down in the comments too. And if this is the first time you've watched, why not consider subscribing to the channel. So I'll move on now. Here is last night's topic. Tonight's topic is competitive player killing your game? And there's a reason why this has kind of cropped up into my mind, and I'm going to flick across to the other screen here to show you why. So recently, last week, Guild Ball creators Steamforged had this announcement, and it said basically announcing the end of Guild Ball. And I'm not going to go in and read the details. I'll put a link into the description if you want to go and read it, or if you type in Guild Ball ending, this will come up in the in your list of stuff. So it basically goes through kind of what's happening. They're essentially saying that after 6 years, basically the game is now coming to an end. They're no longer going to produce or sell sort of miniatures for it. They're not going to support the tournament scene anymore. Doesn't mean the game is dead. If the community wants to kind of keep playing it, the community will keep playing it, much the way Blood Bowl did. But they are stopping support of the game. Now, there's some stuff in here that's kind of sort of rippled up and kind of like upset the Guild Ball community a little bit, I would say. And essentially what this says is that there's a little bit of information from the creators and stuff, and this is some of the stuff I want to talk about, and this is some of the stuff that's both it's both sort of got the topic for tonight going. It's also the reason that kind of why I've gone into this a little bit deeper now. So if I scroll down a bit, there's a bit where basically it starts to say here, and it says, we set out to make the cleanest, most balanced miniatures game you could play at the time, and we achieved this hands down, flat out nailed it. I wouldn't disagree that they created a very competitive, balanced game. And it says here that Guild Ball was a competitive player's dream. It rewarded player skill and experience with a very flat probability curve to minimise variance. This is something I'm going to come back to later, so remember that term about flat probability curve and minimising variance. The competitive scene grew and grew. It says, but this ended up hurting the lifespan of the game. And that is really the topic that I want to talk about tonight. Can a competitive game actually kill a game off before its time? Or can it kill a game off earlier than a game that's potentially not competitive? I'm killing the game is probably provocative. That's what I'm trying to do. I want you to come and click and watch this. But it's ending the game as far as Steamforged are concerned. And this is it's relevant for other games too. What they go on to say is that Guild Ball became the type of game where you win your first game, your demo, and then lose the next 100 games. When matched against a lesser skilled or inexperienced opponent, a better player would simply win the vast majority of games. It says here now is that the competitive scene began to dominate the design space for wilder, more fun elements, and began to shrink. Now, this is something I'm going to talk about as well. It says new minis were either overpowered or trashed here the second they were announced. Why take a new model when XYZ already fills that role? The style of gameplay changed to a low-risk, ultra-conservative player where the ball was often deliberately sidelined. Now, in a game that's based around football, this is kind of taking the game in a direction that they never really imagined it to be. And they say that this wasn't the Guild Ball we envisaged. We always knew that this would happen eventually. From the beginning, we said Guild Ball had a shelf life, and if we wanted to avoid the game collapsing under its own weight through skew creep and shrinking design space. With a game that new players found tough to get into and a gameplay style that wasn't very football-y, the community began to dwindle. So this is kind of something else I'm going to touch on as well. if I can come further down, a few topics I've kind of highlighted. Season 5 was always intended to be the end of the current story arc. Season 5 is what we're in at the moment. And with a polished set of rules and well-balanced minis, it was the perfect moment for Guild Ball to come to an end. They also go on to say here as well, games that thrive on competitive play require players to be in the same location at the same time. With stores on lockdown and events being cancelled, the future of Guild Ball became harder and harder to envisage in the current climate. And then also, what else was I wanted to talk on? They did a field test basically, and it got them some interesting results. And it says bringing in new players would mean changing the game too much for existing players to remain happy. Now that's quite kind of telling and stuff, and it's one of the let me just get the right screen. It's one of the points I want to talk on. So that's the reason behind it. It's less to do with the actual sort of tournaments themselves, less to do with the players, and it's more to do with if you design a competitive game, what is the effect on that, and what does it do? So I want to start by kind of defining what do I mean by competitive play and competitive players. Now I think that players essentially fall into 3 different groups. Kind of like sort of give me some artistic license here. I think there's a casual player. These are the player that kind of they play at home. They maybe play in stores or clubs. They prefer the story and the narrative experience of the game, and they want to have fun over winning. Winning isn't their kind of main target when they play a game. They want to just have a fun experience. You then have competitive players. Competitive players are kind of like the list builders, the math hammer type players. They choose the rules over the models. So if a rule is really, really kind of strong on a particular model, it doesn't really matter what that model looks like. They'll still take that model because they like the rule. If a model looks great, but the rules aren't great, it won't see the table kind of thing. They enjoy going to tournaments and they enjoy sort of competing. They shift their armies and they shift their options that they choose as the meta shifts. They're constantly kind of moving along that kind of lines. They tend to play to win. That seems to be the most important part of the game for them. And even when they play casual games at a local club or at a store, they're essentially really just getting tournament practice in. That's what you tend to find with a more competitive player. And then basically the third type is people who are just somewhere in the middle of those 2 sections. They might still attend events or tournaments, but it's usually just to play more games and maybe have a few beers on the night time, socialise, meet people they don't see very often. They might still enjoy the list building side of things, but they'll tend to include the models they like. They'll tend to go rule of cool over the most kind of like optimal list, if you like. And they tend to stay quite close to the meta just to understand what's going on, and so that they can still build a list that is essentially still kind of it's still sort of playable in a tournament. They're not going to basically kind of lose turn 1 in the first event, if you like. So competitive play for me is really, it's where the aim is to win. That's what they're going for. It's where the wider hobby takes a bit of a backseat, and winning is the most important part. So that's my definition. I'm not saying that is the definition. That's where I'm coming from for what I'm going to talk about tonight. So I want to talk a little bit about the kind of the history of competitive play and a bit of a history about gaming as well, just to set the scene. So if we go back to the 80s and 90s, Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer 40k were probably the 2 main games. There wasn't really a lot else. I mean, let's exclude historical stuff for the moment. It's a bit of a different topic. But within the kind of the mainstream, if you like, and I say that in inverted commas, tabletop gaming, Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer 40k were kind of like the big ones. They were the go-to games. And we did have competitive events. Warhammer Fantasy had a huge big tournament scene. But they weren't run by Games Workshop so much. They were run by the community. Games Workshop did have their own tournaments at Warhammer World, but they were very much played by the rules in the book, and they were played with having fun as the intention generally. Tournaments that were run by the community tended to have what you call compacts, and compacts are basically, they are adjusted rules for the game, or for the lists or the options you can take to try and balance out the game and make it more balanced for competitive play. And this is something that basically that we don't really tend to see so much these days, but we did back then. They were created by the community themselves. GW back then very vocally were a miniatures company first, and that basically any rules that they had were really a vehicle to sell miniatures. They were less about the rules and more about the actual miniatures themselves. GW got a little bit complacent at this time as well, and they became kind of comfortable being the biggest fish in the pond, basically. So they kind of just relaxed a little bit. They were quite happy just to sell what they're selling and be that big company, really. We then fast forward to the 2000s, and other independent companies are starting to spring up around now, and they're trying to base their games around the competitive side of things. They see that there's a bit of a market there that Games Workshop are not really kind of spending too much time on. They can also see that they can't really compete with Games Workshop on that hobby casual side of things. It's like trying to climb a mountain, basically. So they intentionally go after this kind of really tight rule set, competitive market. The rules are designed to be really tight. They're designed to be balanced, and the community don't need to kind of create these compacts for them to make the tournaments sort of more balanced, if you like. So these games are games like War Machine, they're games like Infinity, games like Malifaux, games like X-Wing. And these were competitive by design. It's almost that the rules were designed first, and then the minis were almost secondary to it. These companies, they released official player packs. So War Machine very famously had their kind of steamroller pack that they updated every year. And these packs basically are specific tournament rules. They had timings in them, they had scenarios in them, and explained how to run an official War Machine in this instant tournament with prize support, etc. War Machine itself, for example, even had that famous page 5 rule which said, so play like you've got a pair, or put down the metal and go and find something made of plastic. A very genuine dig at Games Workshop and their plastic miniatures, and it was really that kind of almost like that play like you've got a pair was the aggressive nature of this game is competitive. If you don't like it, don't play it kind of thing. So then over a number of years, we've got the growth of miniature gaming, and that basically now we see miniature gaming growing. Companies begin to use Kickstarter as a way to launch games and get lots of options out to players quite quickly. Competitive games only work when there are lots of options. If you've only got 2 factions, it's very difficult, or if you've only got 2 factions and very limited numbers of models, it's very difficult to get a competitive scene up, because essentially you end up with one list that basically is the kind of top tier. So the competitive scene all basically go after that kind of stuff. Games like Guild Ball came up from this. Guild Ball from Steamforge we've just been talking about, and essentially that was basically designed to be a competitive game. The two creators, Rich Locksman and Matt Hart, come from playing in that War Machine community. They loved War Machine, they loved tournament player, and they wanted to create their own game, but had that tournament scene in mind. Around this time, probably somewhere around kind of 2015-ish, Games Workshop began to kind of wake up and they begin to see what's happening in the kind of like in the market. They start bringing back some of their older titles like Blood Bowl, and they bring back Necromunda. They create some new games like Silver Tower, and they start to reclaim some of that kind of casual market that maybe some people who were just used to playing their bigger scale army games like 40k and fantasy were starting to drift away from a little bit. And it's at this point, like by this point, games like War Machine, Malifaux, and X-Wing, they've reached a point where the games are becoming quite bloated now. They've had a few sort of adjustments to rules. They've had like points updates. They've got a lot of miniatures that are out there. And the competitive scene's dominated the way these games basically, the way they're developed, the way they're expanded, and the way that they're sold. The communities for these games are full of veteran players who've been playing for years, and the design space basically becomes very small because the designers for these competitive games, they want to keep the rules tight and they want to keep the rules balanced, but they're constantly trying to tinker it, to overcome the meta, to change the way the game's being played if it's not really what their intention was. They have to keep bringing in more miniatures to sell because they don't make money tinkering with the rules for free. It's all about selling miniatures that keep them afloat, if you like. And that's the background to this. So why do I say it's competitive play killing games? Now, there's one major difference between 40k and AOS and probably all the other games, and people will be saying, oh, well, 40k is competitive and that doesn't look like it's going to die anytime soon. The biggest difference is GW sell miniatures and miniatures kits. They sell the entire hobby experience, and then they sell rules to basically use these miniatures. The other companies basically sell games and then have to sell miniatures to make the money to keep these things going. They focus on the rules. When a game's designed to be finely balanced, what tends to happen is that the randomness of the game is reduced as far as possible. And this is when I come back, if I can kind of see that note, what was the term I said before. It was about the very flat probability curve. The more you reduce the randomness in a game, the more it comes down to player skill, player knowledge, player experience. And whilst that might be really good for a balanced sort of tournament game, it doesn't make it very fun. It actually becomes quite sort of dull for casual players. So if you play these games, if you're at like a pick-up games at a store or something like that, the player with the most experience will generally crush the kind of the newer player. These games tend to be full of those kind of gotcha moments. If you think about War Machine as an example, this cast a kill type thing, it really punishes any not optimal player sort of positioning. So if you're a new player and you're not expecting these models to do certain things, you'll be punished instantly and punished quite hard. Dice rolls become a lot less kind of important in these games, and that these moments of randomness, these are the moments of randomness that we talk about. These are the bits we remember when we play these games, and those moments almost disappear. Like if you think about exploding 8s in certain games, they introduce a huge randomness. However, those are the moments you talk about. Those ones where you're down to your last model and you roll an 8 and then an 8 and then an 8 and then an 8 and you take out their kind of leader and it wins you the game. That's random. That really kind of implies that it's not a balanced game when that happens. How can my little model take out your huge big kind of leader model? But those are the moments you talk about. Those are the kind of the exciting moments that you tell your friends about down the club the next week, if you like. But they kind of disappear from the game. On the flip side, too much randomness also hurts the game. Nobody wants to have a game where basically it doesn't matter how good you are at a game or what decisions you make. The rolls of too many dice basically kind of counteracts that. So there is a fine balance to be had there. There've been examples in games like X-Wing in its first iteration where actually the list builds were so basically fine-tuned, the dice were almost irrelevant. Like it didn't matter if you rolled to hit or not, because there was stuff on your cards, there was stuff in your list build that guaranteed certain things would happen, and lists were built around this. And Steamforged said themselves in that kind of explanation that I read out there about how in Guild Ball the ball had become a smaller part of the playing experience, and that the game became quite cagey amongst like sort of player fears about like a mistake being exploited. So after 10 years, like a model line becomes quite bloated, and the rules are constantly changing to accommodate these balance issues. It's harder to design new additions. There's probably already something in the range that kind of does the job better anyway. So you essentially basically, people aren't buying for the aesthetics and for the cool backstories. They're only buying these stuff in competitive games when the model does something special. And what generally happens is if that model does something special, everybody cries how overpowered it is, and it gets nerfed into obscurity. And if it doesn't come out and doesn't give you anything benefit, it doesn't sell anything. And that's where these games get into a really kind of dangerous territory at this point. Like power creep is a really strong sales model. If everything you bring out is slightly stronger than everything before it, people will buy it. It's good for sales. It's not good for a balanced competitive game. It becomes difficult for new players to get into the games because essentially there's a huge wide range. I mean, I think Guild Ball had like sort of 250 models available at the point when they've basically pulled the plug on it. And as a new player, it's quite difficult to know where to get started. The community did say that there were some bigger issues around kind of stock issues and some quality issues. I don't really know enough about that to kind of go into it and to confirm or deny it kind of thing. I know there were some quality issues around resins and stuff, but if new players are put off because they start playing the game and they basically just get their backsides kicked on every game they play, and there are too much choice and everybody they play against basically has a huge kind of range of stuff to choose from, that's quite off-putting for a new player. It's also at the point when retailers just don't know what to stock anymore. Their local player base have pretty much got everything that they want. New players are not coming in. And this is it means that basically if new players aren't entering it and existing players already have everything they want, sales are pretty much diminishing. This is probably where Warhammer Fantasy got to. So at this point, a game has really got two options. It can either, you can relaunch it, you can kind of rejig the rules, come up with a second edition, you can tweak the whole thing and relaunch it again and try to appeal to a new player base without upsetting your existing players. And then, and essentially, Steamforge have referred to this, and when they said that they did kind of some of their field tests and stuff, there's been some complaints about that as well, but let's just take it on face value of what they've written. There was some feedback came that if the game was changed dramatically to allow an easier entry point for new players, veteran players wouldn't be happy with it. I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit there, but that's basically what their document says. The other thing you can do is basically you can just call it a day, like Steamforge has just done. The game's reached its kind of its end of its lifespan, if you like, and it's no longer financially viable. They mentioned something about they released some captains recently just to kind of see how big the game was at this point, and I think that kind of gave them an idea of just what those sales were like, if you like. Now, one thing I would say is that the backlash that people are giving Steamforge about this announcement is they feel, and I can understand why they feel it is, they feel Steamforge are blaming the competitive player base for killing the game. Now, the way I've read it and the research I've done and the more I've looked into this, and I've looked at it from lots of different angles, I don't necessarily think they are blaming the players. That Steamforge games have been kind of honest about this, I think, and that basically it's not intended. I don't think it's intended the way people are necessarily taking it. I think it's because it's the initial design concept of the game was always going to lead to this point. If you base it around a competitive rule set, but you need to sell minis to keep the business kind of sustainable, it only really has a finite lifespan before it basically just becomes bloated and you need to either reboot it or you need to basically get rid of it. If you look at games like War Machine, like Malifaux, like Infinity and X-Wing, some of those have had a second edition, some of those have had a third edition. Infinity is currently coming up to its fourth edition at the moment. And look at how the popularity of some of them games, War Machine especially, how it's kind of diminished over a period of time, how sort of third edition was never quite as good as third edition was never quite as good as second edition. It's starting to tail off a little bit, and essentially you've got Privateer Press are looking to bring in Warcaster now because they know that War Machine's on the downward trend. They need the new game coming in to start to try and pick up and carry on the mantle again and get people buying minis again. The miniature companies also don't tend to make models redundant in the way that Magic the Gathering will say, right, all kind of season 1 stuff is now out. We're only playing with seasons 2 and 3. I know that's not called that for Magic, but you get the point I'm making. Miniature companies tend not to do that. I think Warhammer Underworlds is probably the only exception I can think of where they've almost they've tried to keep it fresh by constantly bringing new stuff out and making the older stuff like not compatible any longer for competitive play. The older a game gets, essentially, the less obvious the entry points for new players can become, and the more that basically the veterans of those games, they get a bit bored. Basically, there's nothing really new coming out. I've played it quite intensely for quite some time. Let's have a look and see what else is out there. So we've got no new players coming in. The veterans are leaving. The game is headed in one direction, and there are quite a lot of games out there that have essentially reached the end of their lifespan. Really, there's a lot of companies out there who they're pretty much keeping the games alive in name only. They might talk about them on a blog once in a blue moon. They might release the odd model here and there or something like that, but they're not actively really supporting those games anymore. I'm not going to call them companies out, but you know exactly the kind of the games I'm talking about. Essentially, those games have also reached that same point. They're not really dragging in new players. They're not really catering to their existing market anymore, but people enjoy playing them. And so basically they kind of keep them alive in the spirit of it, really, rather than actually from a business point of view. And purely from a business point of view, these companies are here to make money. That's their priority. And by launching a new game which appeals to a wider audience, that company is going to be making more money. It's going to be sort of more beneficial for the long term than maybe making 1 or 2 models for a game that already has a limited market now at the end of maybe like a 5, 6, 7 year lifespan. And what I think is GW is the exception in this. I think that they managed to walk this line because basically probably about 80% of their player base they're probably casual players. Even not even the player base. Probably 80% of their business is just casual market. It's people who buy the kits. It's people who like to buy paint the stuff. More like hobbyists than gamers necessarily. They're starting to embrace that kind of more competitive end of the market, but their core business is still just selling models to people. They've created these amazing worlds around their games that even when you're not playing the game, you can read the book, you can listen to the audio books, you can basically you can build new model kits, you can like sort of paint stuff up. There's a whole sort of hobby around Games Workshop stuff that isn't necessarily around competitive gaming. Take X-Wing as an example. We've just come through like kind of lockdown stuff now. X-Wing has really suffered by the fact the whole game is based around competitive play. It's based around people getting together and playing the game. There's not a lot of hobby. You can repaint your miniatures, but they come pre-painted, and a lot of people pick the game up because they don't have to paint it. So that's really suffered during this kind of COVID time. Games Workshop are booming. They're doing absolutely fantastic because people have just decided to buy models and paint the armies up that maybe they didn't have time to do, or let's start a new army, I've got time on my hands. People are not necessarily doing that with these more competitive games. So basically all miniatures games go through this. Board games tend not to do it. A company will basically release the standard game. They might release an expansion for it. But then that's pretty much it. That's the end of it. The game's there. You've bought it. Play it as much as you want. We'll move on and we'll create a new game now. And that doesn't really happen with miniatures games. Miniature gamers expect a game to be supported and constantly basically sort of fed into and have stuff to buy for many, many years to come. And I think when the product ends, basically, they feel robbed, basically. They've invested time and money into these games, and players feel robbed that they can no longer buy stuff for a game that they enjoy, even though they still have all of that stuff and that game will still exist. And I can see why people feel that way. But at this point, basically, I'm going to kind of round this up here for what this short video is, and this will be going up live now, so you'll be able to see this one separately. But I'm going to flick back across to the chat, so if you are interested and you want to talk about this, let me know down in the comments at the end of the video, or come across to the live stream and check out what everybody else has been talking about. Thanks for watching my video. I hope that you really enjoyed it. And if you did, why not consider clicking on the suggested video below to see more of the work that I've done. If you'd like to support the long-term sustainability of this channel, why not consider checking out my Patreon, where you can pledge and support from as little as $2 a month, and there is lots of different tiers and bonuses which will give you access to a private Discord server. It will give you free t-shirts, free mugs, a podcast every month, and a number of other things, including getting your name at the end of every video, like these awesome folks who already support me now.